Okay, thank you for bearing with me as we shift the gears a little bit. We just talked about aggregate supply and demand. Now I want to talk about the influence of monetary and fiscal policy when it comes to aggregate demand. So this chapter kind of continues with what we learned about when it came to aggregate supply and demand. Remember, aggregate meaning additional changes, right? So let's take a deeper look at the aggregate demand. And then let's talk about the influence from monetary and fiscal policy on the aggregate demand. So as we discussed in the prior chapter, when it comes to the aggregate demand, of course, it's to the right and down is the slope of the curve. It is important to understand that the wealth effect, interest rate, and exchange rate effects all happen at the same time and have an impact on demand. That's why we call this aggregate demand. These effects incrementally together aggregate small changes affects the demand curve. Yes, that's why we call it aggregate demand. When the prices go down for goods and services, the demand for those goods and services increases. That's what's supposed to normally happen. That's what normally happens. Price goes down, demand goes up. When the price goes up, the demand goes down. Makes perfect sense. In the US economy, we have what's called the wealth effect. This is the least important effect on aggregate demand. Money is a small part of household wealth. You might think to yourself, well, Dr. B, how's it possible? You know, more money you have, the wealthier you are. That's not necessarily true. No, that's not how wealth works. Money is the tool we use to build wealth, yes. But that's not how wealth is measured. Wealth is measured by what you own minus what you owe. That's how you find your what we call net worth. The individual person's net worth is measured by taking what you own like your house, your car, your whatever, minus what you owe. What you own minus what you owe is called your net worth. The net worth is the impact of the wealth effect. Okay? It's not the actual money that individuals have. So that's why we say the wealth effect has a very little impact. Okay? The exchange rate has an impact, but it's not huge. Okay? Exports and imports based off are a small fraction of the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the production of goods and services and the consumption of those goods and services. That's how we measure GDP. And of course, the interest rate is probably the most important. Now, when it comes to the aggregate demand. For those of you who have taken accounting with me, you may remember this term called liquidity. Liquidity tells us how quickly I can convert an asset into cash. That is what we call liquidity. How fast I can convert an asset into cash. Liquidity. Accounting, that's how we measure liquidity. In economics, it's a very similar type of thought process. The Keynesian theory of liquidity is based off of the adjustment to the money supply and demand to bring it into balance. Okay. Liquidity. Quickly, we can convert things into cash. We take into consideration things like the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. The assumption is that there's an expected rate of inflation and it's constant. That is the theory of liquidity. The inflation rate typically, normally, is around 2% every year. That's normal. Between 2 and 4%, very normal. That's a normal inflation rate. It's supposed to. We're supposed to have inflation. That's a normal thing. That's a good thing. It needs to be low, and it needs to be consistent or continuous. Obviously, that wasn't true over the past couple of years, and it's still not exactly true. But when it goes down and it normalizes the inflation rates, things will become more normal, more steady. So that's liquidity. The money supply, as you know, is controlled by the Federal Reserve. They control how much money is in circulation, quantity. The Federal Reserve uses fixed policy, not interest rates, but policy, to control the amount of money, currency, in circulation. Okay? The Federal Reserve oftentimes changes the money supply in circulation and within the reserve banking system in order to assist the purchase and sale of government bonds in the open market for operations. The government raises money in two different ways. One is through taxation. The other part is through selling bonds. Yeah. That's how the government finances itself. They sell bonds and they collect taxes. That's how the government funds itself and how they make purchases. The money demand is liquidity. How quickly we can convert things into cash. Money, cash, is the most liquid asset. It can be used to buy goods and services. It can be used to invest. It can be used to do a lot of different things. The interest rate is an opportunity cost of holding money. In other words, the interest rate is the cost of money. Right? For example, if you took out a loan in order to get cash, the loan has an interest rate. That interest rate is the cost of borrowing the money. Money on the demand curve is downward sloping and to the right, just like most other demand curves. When there's an increase in the interest rate, there's an increase in the cost of holding that money. When interest rates go up, the quantity demanded goes down. Higher borrowing rates, less people want to borrow. Real simple. When there's a point of equilibrium in the money market, that is where the interest rate adjusts to balance the supply and the demand of money. The equilibrium is the interest rate in the money market. The quantity of the money demanded balances for the money supplied. The point of equilibrium is the interest rate. If the interest rate is greater than the current point of the equilibrium, there's less quantity, there's less demand. Yeah. If the interest rate is greater than the equilibrium, people holding surplus cash will want to buy interest-bearing assets. If the interest rate is greater than the equilibrium, the interest rate needs to come down, and more people will be willing to hold cash until equilibrium is established again. If the interest rate is lower than the point of equilibrium, the quantity of money people want to hold will be greater than the quantity supplied. In other words, demand will be higher when the interest rate is less than equilibrium. Absolutely. People will increase their holdings in money and they'll sell interest-bearing assets in order to get more money. Yeah. The interest rate will eventually go up and that reestablish the point of equilibrium. Here we have it graphically. Equilibrium interest rate is where the money supply equals the money demand. When the interest rates go up, the demand goes down. Interest rates go down, the demand goes up. And then eventually it gets balanced back out by the Federal Reserve. So the aggregate demand. As you know from our discussion in the previous chapter, the aggregate demand is downward sloping and to the right. Higher prices lead to higher money demanded. Higher money demanded leads to higher interest rates. Higher interest rates leads to reduction of quantity of goods and services demanded. So in looking at the money market, the money supply is fixed quantity by the Federal Reserve. When there's a higher amount of money demanded, there's a shift in the demand curve to the right, which oftentimes leads to an increase in the interest rate, which will ultimately lead to a shift in the point of equilibrium. The aggregate demand curve shifts when when the quantity of goods and services change at particular price points. When it comes to monetary supply, there's an increase in the money supplied at aggregate demand, a decrease in the money supplied at aggregate demand, and a shift in the demand curve. In other words, the quantity goes up, quantity goes down, there's going to be a shift in the demand curve based off of what happens. The Federal Reserve, of course, influences the increase and decrease of the quantity of money in the supply system. The money supply curve will shift to the right, interest rates will come down. At any given price level, there will be an increase in the quantity demanded. The aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And here we see that graphically. Interest rates come down, demand goes up. Interest rate comes down, demand goes up. There's a shift in this money supplied by the Federal Reserve, which is why it's still vertical. Yeah. Which of course leads to a shift in the aggregate demand. Price comes down, demand goes up. If the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply, the demand curve will shift to the left. There will be an increase in interest rates, and the price will come down. I'm sorry, the price will go up when there's a decrease in the quantity of demand of goods and services. And the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left, which is the opposite of the other side. When it comes to the federal funds rate, we look at things like the interest rate, bank charges, and short-term loans. The Federal Reserve targets the federal funds rate based off of the Federal Reserve Board meetings and open market operations. That's when they decide to adjust money supply. This policy impacts changes in monetary policy aimed at expanding the aggregate demand, which results in increased money supply and lower interest rates. Higher supply, lower interest rates. Lower supply, higher interest rates. Makes sense. The Federal Reserve tries to avoid what we call a liquidity trap. This happens when interest rates fall to zero. Money supply may no longer be effective because we use money supply to influence interest rates. Less money in circulation, higher interest rates. More money in circulation, lower interest rates. That's the idea. We don't want it to be zero. If the interest rate gets to zero, that's a problem because an increase or decrease in the money supply might not affect the interest rate. When interest rates are low, central bank continues to use other tools to get the interest rate back up, which oftentimes leads to inflation when the interest rate rises too quickly. So they try to stimulate inflation when the interest rates are low. When interest rates do reach the lower bounds or hit zero or close to zero, we try to set the interest rate above zero, which raises inflation. Modern inflation, of course, gives monetary supply policymakers more room to stimulate the economy whenever needed. And we've seen this most recently. We saw it during the pandemic when the federal government tried to stimulate the economy, gave a little bit too much stimulation, which of course led to inflation. So adjustments in the fiscal policy happen when government policymakers get together and they set the level of government spending and taxation. This, of course, has an effect on the aggregate demand, which is also known as the money multiplier effect and the crowding out effect. The multiplier effect, just as the name implies, it multiplies, right? Additional shifts in the aggregate demand result from expansionary efforts to increase incomes, which increase spending. It multiplies. When you have higher income, you spend more. The higher your income goes, the more you spend. That's what we call the multiplier effect. The more you spend provides money to that business has more revenue, they spend more. And then they spend more, and then they spend more. Multiplier effect. The same happens when the government spends money. When the government builds new roads, new schools, etc., the more that they spend has an impact on the overall economy. They spend more, therefore wages are higher, individuals spend more. You see, it's the multiplier effect. Aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, there's increased spending, it shifts to the right again. That's a multiplier effect. Increased spending leads to increased wages, which leads to increased spending. Multiplier effect. It's a response of consumer spending and investment. It increases investment when the government spends more. It increases investment which leads to higher wages and more spending. Multiplier effect. The spending side, the more spending happens, results in higher wages, which leads to more spending. The multiplier effect. There's a formula for this multiplier effect. So this MPC. We take 1 divided by 1 minus the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect happens every time that there's a multiplication. Increased spending leads to increased wages, which leads to increased spending. Every time it multiplies, you see. So because of the multiplier effect, every government dollar spent results in every dollar of aggregate demand, which leads to the consumption of $1. The investment of net exports we can generate more than $1 of investment. The dollar multiplies every time it's used. Okay. Then we also have the crowding out effect. The crowding out effect happens to offset the aggregate demand. It happens when there's expansionary efforts to raise the interest rates, which reduces investment spending. This happened recently when the Federal Reserve decided to increase interest rates in order to combat inflation. When the interest rates go up, the result is companies are less willing to invest because the cost of borrowing money is higher from the higher interest rates. It's what we call crowding out. So, as a result of increased government spending, it shifts to the right, which increases income. The money demand increases, the interest rates go up, which results in the demand curve going to the left. When interest rates go up, the shift is to the left. So here we see the relationship. Interest rates go up, there's a shift to the left. So taxation is another method that the Federal Reserve uses, well, the government uses to affect things like spending. When household incomes rise, we spend. In order to impact that spending, to reduce the spending, they increase taxes. To increase the spending, there's a decrease in taxes. Taxation has a big effect, of course. So, of course, the government uses these tools like taxation, money supply, fiscal and monetary policy to stabilize the economy, to make things a little bit more consistent across the board. Yeah? Consistency is important. Here's an example of such consistency. Congress passed what's called the Employment Act of 1946. As a result of this Employment Act, there was a reduction of economic fluctuations, and there was a stabilization in the supply of workers, which increased to stabilize production. This is a very Keynesian type of theory by using policy to stabilize things, using the aggregate demand to explain short-term economic fluctuations. The government should actively stimulate aggregate demand where needed, but of course, the idea is to maintain full employment levels. So maintain stability. When there's economic stimulus, of course, There's more spending, but is more spending necessarily a good thing? Depends. Economic stimulus, of course, leads to consequences like increased taxation. Yeah. Increased taxation typically leads to less spending. So, of course, people argue for and against the stabilization policies that the government sets forward. Some people believe that the government should stay out of this type of policy making, avoid active use of monetary and fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. That's what most people believe. The effect of the economy is with a big lag. In other words, the government oftentimes is a dog chasing its tail. They're they're behind the effect. Okay. For example, most recently, the government increased interest rates in order to combat inflation. The inflation was already there. Okay. The increased interest rates tried to cut down on the inflation. But the effect doesn't happen until later. You increase the interest rate, it doesn't affect anything for another 3 months. So, what does that mean for next year? It means that they're going to probably need to reduce interest rates because now inflation's under control. So now it's time to reduce the interest rates. You see? So there's that lag of time in between the time of the action and the time the action takes effect. Certain policies are good in the long run. Yes, absolutely. If we leave things alone, the short run will stabilize itself. Okay. So this is a nice example of what we were just talking about. When we see a recession on the horizon, we don't do anything about it until it happens, basically. And then by the time that takes effect, it's already over. So there are ways to implement automated stabilization when it comes to fiscal and monetary policy. Yeah. So as we see the data come in, making incremental changes at a much faster way would be better for the overall economy. This will help prevent recessions. Not entirely, but has a possibility of doing so. Fix the tax system, fix the government spending, and things will, of course, stabilize. So it's impossible to prevent recessions, but we try our best to mitigate them wherever possible. Recessions happen when there's 2 or more consecutive periods of declining gross domestic product. So oftentimes the government uses taxes and spending to combat inflation. Okay, that ends our conversation on the monetary and fiscal policies when it comes to the aggregate demand. Are there any comments, questions, concerns that you had about this content? Anything at all that you can think of? Or did I do okay explaining these concepts, or any burning questions? No, you all okay? Sure. Okay, let's recap where we are in the classroom and what you all need to complete by Sunday. Remember, we're in week 14. Okay, this class ends next week, at the end of next week, on December 3rd. Okay, so here's what you need to do. You need to make sure that everything you have due is completed. All right, past due, current due, all that stuff needs to be done. You cannot pass this class without completing all the work. period. You cannot pass this class without completing all the work, period. It's as simple as that. Okay? So, you got less than 2 weeks. This class is done. I'm not going to accept anything past December 3rd, except for the final. You see? That's a very short amount of time. We're almost done with the class. Please make sure that all your work is done. Okay. What do you need to do by Sunday night? Besides anything that's past due, you have two things. You have a hypothesis on the aggregate supply and demand, which hopefully works. If not, I'll fix it. And then you have the chapter 20 and 21 quiz. Okay, I need you to complete these two things by Sunday night. Any comments, questions, or concerns? Are you all good? You good? Okay. As always, thank you so much for your time today. I sincerely appreciate you and all of your efforts. Please make sure that you get all of your work completed. Very, very important that you do so. Yes, that's the only way you can pass the class is by doing the work. So I know you all heard me. Just want to make sure. Thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate all of you. If you need anything, you can email me, call me, set up office hours, whatever you need. I'm here for you. Okay. I look forward to our conversation on Monday. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate all of you. Have a wonderful rest of your night. Thank you so much. Take care. Good night. Bye bye.